Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the sandals of someone living in ancient Rome, someone who's just been told they're getting divorced. Not with papers or lawyers, but maybe with a brief announcement at breakfast. You're standing in the atrium of your home, still blinking from sleep, and your spouse is calmly untying the knot of your marriage with all the emotional investment of someone canceling a lunch reservation. There's no yelling. No scene. Just a declaration. Maybe a servant glides by with honeyed wine while you realize, that's it. You're out. Your marriage, poof, is gone like the steam from the morning bathhouse. Welcome to Rome, where marriage is more practical than passionate and divorce is as common as a sneeze in the forum. And you? You probably won't survive this without at least 3 side-eye glances from your neighbors and a passive-aggressive poem written about you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from anywhere beyond the Tiber, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the empire you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle through the domus, that classic Roman home with red-tiled roofs and mosaic floors that chill your bare feet. Your marriage wasn't a whirlwind romance, it was a social upgrade, a merging of family names, possibly even a dowry exchange involving a vineyard and 3 goats. The air smells faintly of olive oil and ambition. Because love, as we think of it now, fluttery hearts, Netflix passwords, shared playlists, wasn't the Roman default. Marriage was a business partnership. Your wedding likely involved your father shaking hands with your spouse's father while you stood there in your best stola, mentally counting how many guests spilled wine on your borrowed sandals. And now, standing under that painted ceiling with the faint crack in the fresco of Jupiter hurling a lightning bolt, it's over. Just like that. No courthouse. No filing fee. The Roman legal system, I use civil, didn't demand a reason, only the will. Divorce wasn't scandalous. In fact, for many aristocratic families, it was expected. A tool in the political toolbox. Not working out? No problem. Someone else's daughter just came of age. But this isn't just an elite affair. Even the plebeians, Rome's working-class folks, understood that marriage could be strategic. Maybe your neighbor, Marcus the fish seller, married up and now wants out because the stepfather-in-law won't stop micromanaging his stall layout. Divorce in Rome is like swapping out a senator midterm, abrupt, sometimes messy, but not rare. You hear it all the time, she was divorced 3 times before 30. He left her the same week he got his praetorship. These aren't whispered in horror, they're almost shrugged at. In a world where the average lifespan hovers around 35, you don't have time to be trapped in an unhappy situation. Or in some cases, a politically inconvenient one. Historians still argue whether early Rome had stronger taboos against divorce. Some claim that before the 2nd century BCE, marriage was more sacred, less disposable. But let's be honest, the sources are sketchy. What we do know is that by the late Republic, divorces are happening with casual efficiency, especially among the powerful. Take the Manus marriage, for instance. In this version, the woman passes into her husband's legal control, basically becomes part of his family like another child. In those cases, divorce means returning her to her father's household. Imagine being dumped and then sent home with all your tunics folded neatly and your dowry itemized on a wax tablet. But by your time, Manus marriage is out of fashion. Women stay legally tied to their birth families, retaining more independence. That shift? It opens the door to women being able to leave too. And they do. You know of a woman across the street, Servilia, who packed up, left her husband, and took the nicer mosaics from their bedroom with her. Cold. Divorce, after all, wasn't just about personal failure. It was social theater. If your spouse cheats, you could leave. If they insult your family, leave. If they just don't vibe with your long-term plan of owning a coastal villa by age 40, you guessed it, time to ghost them like Cicero ghosted humility. But don't think this is without emotion. You still remember the tension at dinner parties when that one couple showed up after their split, and she wore his grandmother's brooch. The drama didn't always stay off stage. People took sides. Gossip flew faster than falcons. There's even a fringe story about a Roman woman who allegedly divorced her husband because he ate in a noisy, unrefined way. Whether that's fact or satire is debated, but it shows how thin the excuses could be. Love him but hate his table manners? That's apparently a deal breaker. And it didn't require mutual consent. Either party could say the word. There wasn't a need for third-party approval or religious justification. Just a desire to end it. Divorce was a social contract torn in two, not a moral failure. Well, unless your family was especially pious or traditional. Then you might get a stern letter. Possibly from an uncle who thinks you're bringing shame upon the household, which is rich coming from a guy who owns a vomiting couch. You walk into the courtyard, sunlight spilling through the columns, and wonder what comes next. The gods? They don't care. No one's sacrificing goats over a breakup. But your friends will care. Your social standing might take a hit, or it might improve. That depends entirely on who dumped whom, who's wealthier, and whether or not you keep the family parrot. In some cases, people got divorced just to remarry someone else more aligned with their current goals. Like changing careers, or chariots. The trick was surviving the gossip. Especially if your spouse was politically powerful. You're already picturing a local playwright slipping your story into a satire, maybe naming you Flavia the Flaky. But all around you, Rome keeps turning. The baker shouts, the aqueduct groans, a kid sells figs outside your doorway. Life moves on. So will you. Maybe. Or maybe you'll just take a slow walk to the temple of Venus and whisper a few prayers while pretending you're not deeply hoping your next match has fewer opinions about fish sauce. You sit down on a stone bench just outside the forum, letting the warm marble pull the tension from your back. The hum of Roman life bustles around you, merchants haggling over garum, magistrates marching past with scrolls tucked under their arms, a pair of children chasing each other around a pillar, and through it all, you find yourself thinking about Roman law. Not the scary kind with executions and lions. The other kind. The quiet laws about love, or the lack of it. Roman marriage law isn't written in love poems. It's in property codes, in obligations, and in things you can transfer between families, like goats, daughters, or vineyard plots. Marriage and divorce are bound up in consensus, that is, mutual agreement. But here's the kicker, the agreement doesn't have to last. As soon as one of you stops agreeing to be married, that's enough. Boom, divorce. Under Roman law, this freedom stems from a simple principle. Just as two people can choose to form a connubium, a legal union, they can also choose to dissolve it. No ceremonies, no rituals, not even a formal statement is required, though you'll usually send a written note or verbally state, tua's residential tibi habito, take your things and go. Yes. That was an actual breakup line. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't romantic. It was effective. Historians still argue whether this simplicity gave Roman society more emotional freedom, or whether it just made relationships colder. On one hand, people weren't trapped in miserable unions. On the other, there wasn't a strong expectation of trying to work through things either. If the match wasn't serving a purpose anymore, financial, political, or reproductive, you cut ties. You'd think that meant everyone was divorcing everyone all the time, but not quite. For the lower classes, divorce was still less common, not because of deeper love necessarily, but because of the complications. The poor didn't always have the legal education or the financial incentive to go through with it. A split meant reshuffling living arrangements, work, childcare. It could feel more like tearing a rug in two than just slipping off a ring. Still, in upper-class Roman society, it was almost a sport. A well-known senator divorced his wife because Julius Caesar glanced at her too long during a festival. Another had multiple marriages in a decade, all linked to shifting alliances and ambition. There was even a famous case where a woman divorced and remarried on the very same day. Talk about efficiency. The laws themselves evolved over time. In the early Republic, most marriages were cum manu, with hand. These made the woman legally part of her husband's household. But as we mentioned earlier, by the late Republic and early Empire, a different form became common, sine manu, without hand. These allowed a woman to stay under her father's legal authority, or in some cases, her own if she had no male guardian and enough property. This meant that when the marriage ended, she didn't need her husband's permission, and she didn't have to grovel or beg. She simply left. Her dowry was returned, minus damages or penalties, depending on how messy the breakup got, and she moved on. Of course, not everything was sunshine and laurel leaves. There were loopholes. Always are. Some divorces came with financial penalties. If the wife was accused of adultery, she could lose part, or all, of her dowry. And let's be honest, Roman definitions of adultery weren't exactly equal. A man could sleep with slaves or prostitutes without legal consequence. A woman, on the other hand, could be punished for so much as flirting with the wrong senator. Fair? No. But welcome to Rome. In fact, Augustus, yes, that Augustus, golden boy of the empire, introduced new morality laws in 18 BCE called the Lex Julia de Adulteriis. These cracked down on adultery and promoted traditional marriage values. Under these rules, if a husband discovered his wife cheating, he had to divorce her, or he could be prosecuted for lenocinium, basically pimping out your wife by tolerating the affair. Romantic, right? Still, people found ways around the system. Some staged affairs to frame their spouses. Others accused rivals of immoral behavior just to force a separation. And then there were those who used the rules to escape their own legal troubles. Want to dodge an inheritance clause? Get divorced. Want to block a political scandal? Marry your mistress, then dump her later when things cool off. You remember a story told by your cousin, she swears it's true, about a senator who faked a marriage just long enough to claim his wife's estate, then filed for divorce the morning after the inheritance cleared. Fringe detail? Maybe. But in Rome, nothing surprises you anymore. And here's something odd, the word divorce in Latin, divortium, isn't drenched in tragedy. It literally just means a turning apart. Like two roads splitting. It doesn't imply fault, heartbreak, or betrayal. It's neutral. Dry. Bureaucratic. The drama wasn't in the law. The drama came later, usually from your in-laws. You stretch your legs. The bench has warmed under the sun, and somewhere nearby, a flute player fills the air with soft, off-key music. You glance across the plaza and spot a couple walking together, a man and a woman, both well-dressed, likely married. You wonder how long they'll last. Not out of cynicism, but realism. In Rome, marriage isn't permanent. It's conditional. Maybe that's freeing. Or maybe it's exhausting. You once heard a philosopher, probably one of those Stoic types, mutter that Roman marriage is like tying yourself to a log in a river and pretending you're steering. The water moves, the politics shift, the alliances twist, and all you can do is smile and hope you don't capsize. You stand and brush the dust from your tunic. You're not bitter. Well, maybe a little. But mostly, you're just adjusting to the rhythm of a culture where love bends to law, and law bends to convenience. Your divorce isn't a scarlet letter. It's a minor note in your public record. A footnote on a tablet. It might even be forgotten in a few weeks, unless you're particularly petty, in which case, someone will compose a short poem mocking your handwriting and distribute it on wax slates near the baths. That's the beauty of Rome. If the laws don't bind your heart, they at least give it room to wiggle free. You step carefully over a cluster of orange peels outside a bakery and head home, or at least the place you lived before this whole divorcium business unfolded. The slaves are still there, scrubbing mosaic tiles and whispering gossip about your dramatic breakfast announcement. And as you settle back into a chair near the impluvium, the open pool that collects rainwater in the center of the house, you realize the oddest truth about Roman marriage: you never really belonged to your spouse. You were property. Sort of. Okay, not in the way a stool or a goat was property, but in a legal sense, you might as well have come with a price tag and a wax receipt. You remember the terms. The moment you were married, your identity shifted. If it was one of those older come marriages, you became part of your husband's household, his familia, under his full legal control. You couldn't own property, make contracts, or really say no to much of anything. You were, for all practical purposes, an appendage. But things changed with the growing popularity of sine manu unions. In those, you remained tied to your father's family. Technically, he still had legal power over you, which was somehow both better and worse. Better because it gave you more independence from your husband, worse because your father could still make decisions about your life like you were one of his marble busts. Still, in both cases, your role was clear: produce children, manage the household, stay appropriately invisible at social events unless dramatically overdressed. And divorce? That process was a legal unthreading of a deal. Your dowry, the infamous dose, was central to the whole business. It wasn't just a gift. It was a security deposit. Something your husband held on to but had to give back if things went sour. Unless, of course, he could prove you were the problem. And now, here you are, calculating your worth like a banker balancing ledgers. The couches, the oil lamps, the peacocks, whose are they? And worse, what about the slaves? Yes, slaves. Divorce, like everything in Rome, often involved enslaved people not just as observers but as assets. A dowry might include not just coin, but people. A gifted ancilla, a female household slave, might have been part of your marriage package. Now, in divorce, there's the awkward question of whether she returns with you, stays with your ex-spouse, or gets sold to cover a debt neither of you planned on. There's a fringe case you once heard about, a woman who demanded not only her ancilla back after divorce, but also the perfumes and dresses that servant had handled, arguing the labor added value to her appearance. Whether that's fact or a satirical exaggeration, scholars still bicker. You also think of your friend Julia. She got divorced last year and spent the next 6 months in court arguing over a silver lamp and an especially well-trained parrot. Apparently, it could mimic her ex-husband's disapproving grunt. When Roman law handled people like property, divorce didn't untangle love, it split inventory. And then there's the matter of reputation. A man divorcing his wife might say it's for modesty, or for family honor, or because she spent too much time at the theater. But everyone knew the real reasons were often more calculating: a better alliance, a younger bride, a father-in-law with more pull in the Senate. A woman divorcing her husband? That raised eyebrows. Unless she had a strong family behind her or a dowry that could bankrupt a small province, she risked losing not just her husband, but social capital. Yet even that started to shift over time. Wealthy Roman women, especially in the late Republic and early Empire, began to flex more freedom. You've seen it. Women managing estates, making investments, attending social events on their own. Some even chose not to remarry. Not because they were heartbroken, but because being single made them legally autonomous. And no longer being technically someone's property. That was deliciously freeing. There's a mainstream historical account of Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers. After her husband died, she refused every suitor, including kings, to manage her son's education and estates herself. Widows had serious power. Divorcees, if smart and wealthy, could too. Still, for most Roman women, life wasn't so cushy. The idea of being property didn't vanish with new marriage trends. Your ex-husband could still try to tarnish your reputation. That poem he circulated? The one comparing your personality to spoiled fish? Not subtle. Even the concept of pudicitia, Roman female modesty, lingered over divorce like a vulture. A woman who left too many husbands was seen as unstable or greedy. A man who left too many wives. Just ambitious. You shake your head and wander into the garden. The air smells like rosemary and something slightly burning from the neighbor's kitchen. You think about how something as personal as a failed relationship becomes a legal transaction, how it all comes down to who owns what, who owes what, and what value gets assigned to you once love, or at least marriage, leaves the room. The weirdest thing is how normalized it all is. No ceremony to end it. No party. You simply revert. Your legal identity unplugs and reconnects like a socket in someone else's wall. Married today, daughter again tomorrow. Maybe that's what makes this feel so surreal. You aren't crying. You aren't yelling. You're just negotiating, your body, your wealth, your place in someone's household like you're a dining table with legs slightly uneven. There's a scholarly debate still unresolved over just how much agency Roman women really had in divorce. Some argue women were puppets of powerful families, their exits staged by fathers or brothers. Others point to letters, inscriptions, and poetry that hint at fierce, clever, independent women playing the system like seasoned politicians. Maybe both are true. Maybe you're somewhere in between. As the sun dips low, casting long shadows across the garden path, you hear a soft knock. A messenger with a wax tablet. Maybe it's from your ex. Maybe it's a formal record. Or maybe it's your father, reminding you that he wants the silver serving dish returned. You sigh, pocket the tablet, and remind yourself, you are no one's property anymore. Well, until the next marriage. You wake to the sound of bronze clanging, a neighbor's servant, probably knocking over amphorae again, and blink groggily in the golden Roman sunlight. Your first thought isn't about breakfast or even that persistent neck cramp. It's about your social standing. Specifically, what your recent divorce just did to it. Because in Rome, marriage is strategy. A contract, yes. But also a ladder. And your ex? They just pulled the rug out from under you. You shuffle toward the atrium, where two cousins are already whispering near the fountain. Their glances slice through the morning air. You ignore them, but you know what they're thinking. How long before she remarries? Who will take her now? But don't feel too bad. Your story is just one thread in a giant social tapestry where marriage and divorce are less about romance and more about maneuvering through a political labyrinth. It's a game of alliances, not affection. Take your neighbor across the street. A senator, ambitious, power-hungry, and charming only in a way that makes you want to double-lock your coin pouch. He married 3 times in 15 years. Not because he's hard to live with, though, honestly, probably yes, but because each marriage aligned him with a more powerful family. When his wife's father died, and her family influence plummeted, he divorced her with all the ceremony of returning a tunic that didn't fit. You realize now that your own marriage wasn't a love story. It was a merger. Your father liked the match. Your dowry padded the deal. Your new family brought you closer to certain circles, certain banquets, certain magistrates, certain conversations that mattered. And now that it's over, you're not just emotionally untethered, you're politically adrift. The Roman elite played marriage like a chessboard. Aligning with the right house could elevate you to the consulship. Marrying poorly could trap you in obscurity. Divorce was just one more move in this lifelong game of reputation. Cold? Maybe. But efficient. And it wasn't just men doing the math. Some elite women, especially wealthy widows, navigated the game brilliantly. You've heard about Claudia Metella, fabulously rich, endlessly remarried, and rumored to have turned down a senator because his villa smelled like turnips. Whether the turnip part is true, no one knows. But the point stands. Elite Roman women knew their worth. Historians still debate whether Roman women initiated divorce primarily for personal reasons or political ones. It's tempting to imagine them escaping toxic relationships for fresh starts, but in many cases, they were just as calculating. If their husbands' fortunes fell, or if a better match appeared, they might quietly slip away like cats from a party that turned awkward. And remember, there were no formal vows to break. No binding contracts requiring justification. A marriage in Rome existed as long as it was convenient. The moment it stopped benefiting both parties, or just one, if we're being honest, it ended. You sip watered wine and think about the phrase your aunt used to mutter when people divorced too often: they change spouses like tunics. She meant it as an insult. But secretly, you always liked it. Because in a society where everything is about public image, your clothes, your home, your dignitas, swapping out a spouse sometimes just meant freshening up the outfit. Of course, there were limits. Divorce could backfire. You recall the case of Curia, whose husband divorced her to marry into a wealthier house. The new alliance crumbled, the father-in-law was caught embezzling grain, and Curia? She remarried within a month, to a higher-ranking senator, thank you very much, and had her ex publicly banned from her famous garden parties. That's the thing about Roman social circles, they're small, incestuous, and absolutely petty. Reputation was everything. Divorce could stain it, or polish it. There's also the awkward side of all this, the friends you lose in the split. Because let's be honest, half your social circle came from your ex's connections. Now, you're that person they mention with a wince. Dinner parties get complicated. Someone always forgets to update the guest list, and suddenly you're seated next to your ex's sister-in-law who definitely pretends not to know your name. And then there's your father. He's writing letters, of course. Probably plotting your next marriage like it's a land acquisition. He'll downplay your divorce, call it a temporary realignment, and pretend the dowry return wasn't the most stressful negotiation of the month. You head to the marketplace later, wrapped in a new stola, and sense the change in how people look at you. Not pity, exactly. More, curiosity. Like you've become a character in a public saga. Which, in Rome, you kind of have. Because in this city, your personal life is public theater. Marriages, divorces, affairs, they're watched, judged, gossiped about. You've seen satirical plays where the punchline was a woman who married 6 times before Saturnalia. And don't get you started on the graffiti near the Subura that names every ex-lover of a certain Matrona in order of their nose size. It's like your life is written on scrolls people pass around between courses at banquets. Still, not all of it feels like failure. There's power in being a free agent again. You're not stuck with a man who saw you as leverage. You're not silently pouring wine at yet another dinner party where he brags about his grain contracts. You remember your cousin Lucia. After her divorce, she didn't remarry. She opened a bathhouse instead. People laughed, at first. Then they noticed the marble floors, the imported oils, the Senate wives visiting on the regular. She used her divorce as a launchpad, not an ending. A strange, fringe anecdote floats into your mind, one about a woman who divorced her husband for growing too many pomegranates in their garden. Whether it's apocryphal or allegorical, you get the point. Sometimes the problem isn't huge. Sometimes it's just enough. And maybe your divorce isn't some grand tragedy. Maybe it's just a tiny shift in your social orbit, a chance to rewrite your position in the stars. Rome doesn't care if you were once married. It cares whether you land on your feet. So tomorrow, you'll put on your best jewelry. You'll visit your uncle who has just the right acquaintance for a potential new match. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll take a break from being someone's wife and become something else entirely, someone the poets whisper about not because you were married, but because you were interesting. You're back in your villa's peristyle garden, watching a bee drunkenly tumble through the lavender, when a strange realization sets in: you could have left him. At any time. Sure, Roman law granted both spouses the ability to initiate divorce, but society? Society didn't always make that freedom feel real, especially for women. Still, it was possible. And some women absolutely did it. Boldly. Sometimes even quietly, with nothing more than a servant and a bag of packed sandals. You think about that now, tracing your finger along the chipped edge of a marble bench. Maybe you should have left first. See, in Rome, the line to end a marriage wasn't drawn in the sand, it was painted on the wall in disappearing ink. You didn't need a courtroom, a priest, or even a witness. You could simply say, "I do not wish to remain in this marriage," and walk. But how that went over? Well, that depended on who you were. A man divorcing his wife? Hardly a headline. A woman doing the same? That was a ripple in the social pond. And yet, they did it. Women like you. Matroni from respectable families who knew the law and weren't afraid to use it. You remember the story of Pompeia Paulina, not to be confused with that other Pompeia who scandalously hosted the Bona Dea festival and allegedly flirted with Clodius in drag. Roman drama. Paulina divorced her husband after he lost political favor, distancing herself from his disgrace and preserving her own reputation. Cold? Maybe. But strategic? Absolutely. And then there was the fringe case of Vistilia, who, according to one highly suspect source, divorced one man simply because she liked the way another arranged his toga. That detail might be poetic license, but scholars still debate how literal it is. Whether or not the toga fold was truly that seductive, it's clear that Roman women had more control than most ancient wives could dream of. Still, you had to play it right. Walking away from a marriage required more than legal permission. It required confidence, a little coin, and ideally, a supportive father. Or at the very least, a distracted one. Your ex-husband wasn't cruel. Just politically calculating. You were useful to him, until you weren't. And maybe you could have made the first move. But you hesitated. Because divorcing as a woman in Rome? It carried a price tag that wasn't always measured in coin. First, there's the whisper campaign. A woman leaving her husband without cause could be painted as disloyal, impetuous, or worst of all, un-Roman. Pudicitia, that ideal of Roman feminine virtue, didn't include starter marriages. A divorced woman had to explain herself, often without saying a word. Her clothes, her demeanor, the company she kept, all became silent justifications for her choice. Then, of course, there was the dowry. If you initiated the divorce, you risked losing parts of it, especially if your husband decided to claim some moral high ground. Sure, there were laws protecting you. But those laws were inked on scrolls held by men who'd rather not see you financially independent. So some women took subtler routes. They'd poison the well. Refuse to produce heirs. Undermine their husband's standing with quiet precision. Others leaned into religious excuses, claiming a dream from Juno, or a bad omen from the household lararium as divine permission to exit the marriage. There's one particularly strange case of a woman who supposedly claimed her house's sacred chicken refused to eat in her husband's presence, and therefore, the gods clearly wanted her out. Again, it might be satire. But the fact that such stories circulated tells you everything about how people imagined the quiet power of women in the home. And once a woman did leave, she had options. Plenty remarried, often within months. Some remarried for love, but more often, it was for realignment. Marry a man with a better name, a better estate, a better future. Or marry someone old enough that his death would upgrade you to wealthy widowhood. Strategic, again. Others didn't remarry at all. Those were the outliers, the bold ones. In Rome, being unmarried too long raised eyebrows, especially if you had money. A single woman of means was a social anomaly, almost suspiciously so. Was she a prude? A seductress? A Stoic philosopher in disguise? You think of Hortensia, daughter of the famed orator Hortensius. She gave a public speech during a tax protest in the Forum, outspeaking men with centuries more podium time. Unmarried, sharp-tongued, and totally unbothered by the Senate size. It wasn't easy, though. For every Hortensia, there were a dozen women pressured into respectability through marriage. Divorce might have been your legal right, but staying divorced? That required navigating a society that couldn't quite decide if you were powerful or problematic. And don't forget the servants. They always knew first. Long before your family got the wax tablet. They'd hear the arguments, fold the tunics left on the floor after a slammed door, and whisper over laundry lines. Some were loyal to you, others to him. A divorce often split the household emotionally, not just legally. Especially if you had no children to sway sympathy. Speaking of which, no kids meant fewer complications. No debates over guardianship. No custody arrangements. A clean break. But children? That was another matter. Roman law favored the father's side, usually, but we'll get to that soon. For now, just know that many women weighed their exit against what they might leave behind. Still, women did it. Again and again. Not always publicly, not always loudly, but with purpose. And sometimes, with satisfaction. You lean back, the scent of laurel and old marble thick in your nostrils, and wonder if your sandal-packing moment might still come someday. Not out of bitterness, but choice. Rome allows it. In its own odd, structured way. And the idea that you, yes, you, could end a marriage with nothing but your voice and a quiet exit through the courtyard? That's strangely modern. You rise early the next morning, toes curling against the cool tile of your bedroom, and stretch toward the faint light filtering through the open shutters. The birds are already scandalizing each other in the fig tree, and somewhere nearby, a vendor starts shouting about plums with the desperation of someone who's seen too many quiet mornings. Today, you're feeling oddly philosophical. Not devastated. Not triumphant. Just inquisitive. You've walked away from a Roman marriage, or been walked away from, and somehow, you're still here. So what now? You pull your shawl over your shoulders and think about something strange. For a society 2,000 years in the rearview mirror, Rome had moments of stunning legal progressiveness. It's not something most people expect. In fact, if you told a modern friend that Roman women could initiate divorce, manage estates, and sometimes even own property, they'd raise an eyebrow so high it might dislocate. But here's the twist, all that flexibility didn't apply equally. It depended on where you sat in the social pyramid. The elite had options. The poor had obligations. And if you were enslaved, forget it. Divorce in Rome wasn't just about ending a relationship. It was about who had the privilege to end it. As a free citizen woman, especially one with a family name that got nods of approval in the forum, you had power. Not always comfortable power, not always full autonomy, but the legal space to choose. The ius liberorum laws, which granted special privileges to women who had 3 or more children, even gave you a little boost in status. More legal independence, fewer male guardians breathing down your neck. And under sine monomarriage, you retained property rights and stayed tethered to your birth family. It wasn't full freedom, but it was enough to make decisions. But you remember the faces of those who weren't you. The plebeian wives who worked as weavers, midwives, bread sellers. The women who lived in noisy insulae above the bathhouses and prayed the stairs wouldn't collapse. For them, marriage wasn't a ladder to climb, it was a rope to hang on to. Divorce could mean starvation. Being sent back to a family who couldn't support them. Losing their children. Or becoming invisible altogether. There's a fringe case scholars love to argue about, an inscription found in Ostia naming a woman who divorced and immediately re-entered her old household as a servant. Was she too poor to live alone? Did her family demote her for leaving her husband? No one knows for sure. But it suggests a blurry line between liberty and dependency for women without wealth. And if you were a freed woman, formerly enslaved, now technically free, your choices were even murkier. Your patronus, or former master, could still have legal influence over you. He might pressure you to stay married to someone for business reasons. He might even marry you himself, especially if no Roman citizen women were willing to take him on. Your status was always conditional. Like Rome itself, you had grandeur built on cracks. Then there were the enslaved. Not citizens. Not legally recognized in marriage at all. They had contubernium, an informal union acknowledged socially but not protected by law. A slave couple could be separated at a master's whim. Children? Owned by the household. Love? Real, perhaps, but legally, non-existent. One day, you saw 2 slaves parting behind the kitchen. He was being sold to a different household. She stood by the oven, hands shaking but eyes dry. No legal papers. No farewell ceremony. Just one nod and he was gone. That was their divorce. You've never forgotten it. And what about the men? It's easy to think they had all the power, and in many cases, they did. But even they weren't immune to the whims of structure. A man of low birth who married above his station could be cast aside if his fortunes fell. A freedman who tried to marry too ambitiously might find his union legally blocked. Power played no favorites when ambition exceeded expectation. Still, there was one curious form of protection that surprised even you, the Senatus Consultum Claudianum, a senatorial decree from Emperor Claudius' reign. According to it, if a free woman married a slave without her master's permission, she too could be enslaved. Why? Because her marriage choice dishonored Roman values. It sounds absurd, but it happened. Even within legal boundaries, Roman society punished women for marrying wrongly, especially down the ladder. Divorce might have been legally accessible, but only to those who hadn't already stepped outside the social lines. Historians continue to debate just how progressive Roman family law really was. Was it ahead of its time? Or was it simply another tool of control dressed up as liberty? After all, rights extended only as far as your name, your money, and your father's friends. A patrician woman and a laundress lived in the same city, but not the same world. You pace past your household's lararium, the little shrine for the household gods. You whisper a thank you to them, not because you think they stopped your husband from cheating with the fishmonger's niece, but because you're still standing. Still legally recognized. Still in possession of your stola and your dignity. You make a note to write to your cousin next week. She's been widowed twice, divorced once, and now runs a school for girls teaching them arithmetic and public speaking. Radical, right? Last time you saw her, she quoted Cicero and told a young bride-to-be, "Marry who you like, but be ready to leave if you must." Rome allows it. Rome allows a lot, if you know how to ask. And sometimes, if you don't ask at all. You walk back inside, past the mosaic of Orpheus charming the beasts. A fitting metaphor, maybe. In Rome, to survive divorce, or marriage, you must learn how to charm the beasts, the laws, the families, the whispers. Not with force, but finesse. Not with cries, but quiet, precise decisions. Divorce wasn't the end of you. It was, weirdly, a flex. You're reminded now of a phrase that used to annoy you but now feels oddly empowering. She left him. Short. Sharp. Entirely Roman. You're halfway through your midday nap, face smushed into a silk pillow, mind drifting somewhere between a dream and a snack, when a shout from the atrium yanks you back to consciousness. It's not urgent. Just your household slave, Arya, arguing with someone at the gate. You don't recognize the voice, but it's animated. Male. Young. And far too cheerful for someone standing in the sun during the 6th hour. You rise, wrap yourself in a loose tunic, and quietly slide open the door just enough to hear, and instantly regret it. It's your ex's cousin. Of course it is. He's here with a message, a smile, and what appears to be a caged goose. "You left this behind," he says, holding up the flapping bird like a lost sandal. And just like that, you're reminded of one of the weirdest, most overlooked aspects of Roman divorce, the supporting cast. The meddling relatives. The busybody slaves. The old midwife who just happens to stop by the day after you've separated. The gossipy neighbors whose whispers leak through windows faster than bathhouse steam. Roman divorce might have been legally simple, but socially? It came with a full circus of side characters. Take mothers-in-law, for starters. Yours wasn't awful, per se. But she did have strong opinions about the way you cooked lentils. And about your pala being too daring for funerals. And let's not forget that one comment about your handwriting being passably educated for a provincial. After the divorce, she sent you a parting gift, a single sandal, wrapped in linen, no note. You're still not sure if it was symbolic or just an inventory error. In elite Roman households, family involvement didn't stop at marriage. These unions were business deals, and business partners don't stay quiet when contracts break. Your father's trying to pretend he's unaffected. Your brother is publicly fuming. And your cousin, who has never married and spends most of his time with exotic birds, is now a self-appointed go-between. Even friends pick sides. One of your closest, Flavia, has suddenly become very busy. Too busy for shared wine or gossip at the baths. You suspect her husband told her to distance herself, lest she be infected with divorce energy. Very scientific. Historians still debate how involved families actually were in the day-to-day unraveling of Roman marriages. Some argue that wealthy Romans saw their offspring as adult agents capable of managing their own affairs. Others insist that family honor was so tightly bound to marriage that relatives inevitably got their togas tangled in the process. You lean toward the latter. Because in your case, everyone has an opinion. And don't even get you started on the slaves. You know they talk. They always talk. The cook tells the laundress tells the stable boy, and by the time it reaches your neighbor's gardener, the story has morphed into, he caught her reading erotic poetry to the cat. You can't even be mad. Roman households run on a constant background hum of whispers, and enslaved people are the unsung archivists of domestic life. They see everything. They remember who cried in the garden, who came home late, who brought wine when no one asked for it. There's a fringe account from a satirical play where a servant bet on how long his master's marriage would last. When he won the bet, he used the coin to buy freedom and a goose. Which now feels oddly personal. And then there are the midwives. Midwives in Rome weren't just childbirth specialists. They were trusted confidants. Medical advisors. Secret keepers. A clever obstetrix could make or break your reputation with a few well-placed words. You recall your own, Callista. Tiny, sharp-eyed, smelled of rosemary and vinegar. She once told you flatly, if he makes that face during intimacy again, I recommend a swift exit and a clean tunic. You weren't sure if it was medical advice or metaphor, but honestly, both applied. Midwives sometimes acted as informal counselors during divorces, especially when children or pregnancies were involved. They knew when someone miscarried. When someone faked it. When the timeline of a birth didn't quite match the wedding date. They walked the line between medicine and manipulation like seasoned senators. Then there were friends. The truly loyal ones showed up quietly, slipped you figs and perfume, and never said why they came by. The others? Well, they suddenly started dropping subtle references to their still married status in every sentence. And the matchmakers. Oh, the matchmakers. Not the romantic kind. The economic kind. They're already buzzing, trying to pair you off with someone better suited. Usually someone with a slight limp and extensive land holdings in Etruria. They'll say, he's stable, like that's supposed to make up for the limp and the conversational monotony of boiled cabbage. You're polite, of course. But in your head, you're already imagining a mysterious life as a single woman, living by the sea, adopting abandoned cats and composing scathing poems under a fig tree. There's a particularly quirky tale, almost certainly fictional, about a Roman woman who divorced, then refused all suitors and took up fortune-telling. She supposedly made predictions based on how men buttered their bread. You don't believe it for a second, but you do admire the energy. Scholars argue about how seriously to take these fringe characters in divorce narratives. Are they exaggerations for comedic effect, or reflections of a deeply entangled social web? Probably both. But either way, they're real to you. They fill your days now, arriving with news, gifts, questions. A friend brings over the lamp you left behind. A neighbor offers a dinner invite with just a few friends, code for nosy interrogations. And then there's the random man from your ex's work circle who somehow thinks now is the time to confess that he's always admired your voice. Ugh. You sigh, take the goose from the messenger, and hand it off to Arya. Put it in the back. Let it process its trauma. You can't decide whether you're exhausted or wildly entertained. Probably both. Because while the Roman legal system allows for a clean divorce, Roman society does not. The law says you're untethered. The world says, not so fast. But there's comfort in knowing you're not alone. Thousands of women before you dealt with meddling mothers-in-law, tattling servants, and cousins who bring birds. And tomorrow, you'll laugh about it. Probably with Flavia, once she stops pretending she's too busy organizing her wax tablet collection. You're walking through the forum now, trying not to step in anything left behind by the city's notoriously overworked donkeys. The sun's climbing, and your sandals are sticking slightly with each step. A breeze lifts the hem of your stola, and you take a deep breath, part olive oil, part road dust, part fresh bread being hawked by a boy with more flour on his face than his tray. You didn't plan to pass the Basilica Julia today, but something draws you there. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's memory. Or maybe it's the way the space hums with unfinished arguments and long-decided verdicts. You look around. Lawyers arguing. Scribes scribbling. And in one shadowy corner, a family discussing custody. Well, trying to. Because here's the strange truth. In ancient Rome, custody wasn't usually the courtroom drama modern minds imagine. There weren't weeping parents battling over children like prized heirlooms. No impassioned speeches about weekends and visitation. And often, no question of who gets the kids at all. You duck into a shady alcove and lean against the cool marble. The conversation from that family nearby floats over. A man complains that his wife is trying to keep their son. His sister mutters, "But does she even have the potestas?" And you smile, not because it's funny, but because you've lived that confusion yourself. See, in Rome, legal authority over children, patria potestas, belonged to the father or grandfather, not the mother. Not jointly. Not conditionally. Just flat-out patriarchal dominance. No matter who raised the child day to day, legally the father held the rights. Like a talking custody agreement wrapped in a toga. If you were divorced, and your children were still under the age of maturity, typically around 14 for boys, 12 for girls, they remained under their father's control, unless he voluntarily let them go. Which, let's be real, was rare. Not because all fathers were affectionate or invested, but because children were legal assets. Heirs. Political pawns. Tools for future alliances. You remember the day your daughter, Julia, turned 12. There was a small feast. A carved hairpin as a gift. And a quiet acknowledgement from your ex that she'd now be sent to live with her betrothed's family. Not yours. Not his. The other branch of your tangled Roman vine. You cried later that night, into your wine, like any self-respecting Roman woman, but not because it was sudden. Because it wasn't. Children in Rome were more tethered to bloodlines than emotions. That's not to say Roman parents didn't love their kids. There are countless tombstones and letters full of affection, but the legal system didn't require love to function. It required hierarchy. There's a fringe theory, still debated by scholars, that Roman mothers had more de facto influence over custody than records suggest. Letters from Cicero, Pliny, and others hint at emotional ties and maternal authority that go unrecorded in law books. But without consistent evidence, the historical jury's still out. You push off from the wall and wander down a quieter side street. It smells faintly of garum, Rome's notorious fermented fish sauce, and you make a mental note to breathe through your mouth. Around you, life continues, boys chasing each other with sticks, an old woman scolding a dog, two sisters singing as they carry laundry. And then you spot something that makes you pause, a mother kneeling to tie her son's sandal. He's maybe 5, curly-haired, half asleep in the heat. She presses a kiss to his forehead and shoos him toward the bakery. It's simple. But powerful. Because legal custody is one thing. Real-life attachment is another. And in many Roman households, women raised the children regardless of who owned them on papyrus. Nurses, tutors, elder siblings, they all made up the emotional village. Your daughter still slips into your atrium when she can, asking for honeyed figs or help with her hair. No court needed. Divorce didn't erase motherhood. It just rewrote the terms. Some elite Roman women managed to keep informal custody, especially if the father remarried quickly or moved away. There's an account, obscure but fascinating, of a noblewoman whose ex-husband let her raise all 4 children alone, provided she didn't remarry. A quiet bargain. She agreed, and lived into old age surrounded by them. But there were darker versions, too. Like the woman who lost custody and tried to visit her son during a public festival. The father barred her from the processional area. She was forced to watch him walk by from behind a column, trying not to cry because dignitas matters, even when your heart is cracked like a badly fired amphora. Or the boy sent to his father after a divorce, only to return a year later to the mother's doorstep, silent, withdrawn, and unwilling to speak Latin anymore. No one knows why. Maybe grief. Maybe politics. Maybe he just missed her fig cakes. Custody didn't end parenting. It complicated it. There's also the matter of adoption, which was common among the upper classes. A divorced father might adopt a promising nephew as his heir instead of keeping ties to a biological child raised by his ex-wife. Cold? Maybe. Strategic? Always. In Rome, emotional bonds bowed before political legacy. Still, you think about the tiny sandals left at your threshold. The messy handwriting on wax tablets addressed to Mater. The way your daughter's voice rises when she sings that one song about Venus in spring. And you realize that Roman children weren't always fine, legally or otherwise. They were watched. Weighed. Inherited. Gifted. Bargained over. But also loved. Fiercely, in private. Quietly, in crowded villas. Sloppily, through kisses and scoldings and bedtime stories whispered beside oil lamps. You return home just as the sun dips behind a cloud. Aria brings you wine and dates. Your daughter is napping on the couch with a scroll still in her lap. You don't touch her. Just sit beside her and breathe. Because sometimes, in Rome, being a mother meant nothing legally, but everything emotionally. You're in your storage room now, surrounded by amphorae, folded linens, and one very judgmental cat perched on a crate of dried figs. The air smells like cedar and faint mold, and somewhere nearby, a lizard skitters under a cracked tile. You're here because you've decided it's time to untangle the dowry chest. Yes, that chest, the one packed during your wedding, sealed with good intentions, and now reopened like a legal Pandora's box. Because in Rome, divorce doesn't just mean parting hearts, it means negotiating property, and that means dowry. Dowries were a cornerstone of Roman marriage. Depending on your class and family, it might be a modest pile of silver coins, a few slaves, or entire parcels of land. In your case, it was a sizable mix: jewelry, household furnishings, and a pair of well-trained Greek tutors. You married well, after all. Or so your uncle bragged, while nudging a tax collector into approving the villa addition. Now that the marriage is over, the dowry must return to its original source. Technically, that's your father or male guardian. But in practice, since you're no longer a starry-eyed 16-year-old, you're managing this mess yourself. The Roman legal code on dowries is robust. The general rule? The husband must return the dowry, or whatever remains of it, upon divorce. If he doesn't, the wife or her family can sue. But of course, nothing in Rome is ever that simple. If your husband's the one who initiated the divorce for valid reasons, say, adultery or infertility, you might lose part of the dowry. If you initiated the divorce and he's been a halfway decent spouse, he might keep some of it as compensation. But if your ex was a complete disaster, think, public disgrace, fraud, or being caught sneaking off with a Vestal Virgin, yikes, the law favors full restitution. Historians still argue whether these dowry laws truly empowered women or simply reinforced patriarchal control via property rules. After all, who benefits when the system only works if your father or brother has time to drag your ex to court? You stare at your old wedding necklace, now slightly tarnished. You haven't worn it in years. Beside it is a list, carefully inscribed by your ex's scribe, an inventory of returned items, signed with flourish and, you suspect, smugness. Missing, however, are the tutors. They've been transferred, allegedly, to a cousin's estate. Convenient. There's an obscure case from the reign of Claudius involving a dowry dispute so bitter that the ex-wife bribed a priest to curse the husband's goats until he repaid her. Goat deaths followed. Legal consequences did not. You won't go that far. But you do write a sharp note requesting the return of the tutors, or a fair replacement in denarii. You fold it with just enough creases to suggest restrained anger. Your cat meows approvingly. Dowry wasn't just about money. It was a declaration of status. The bigger the dowry, the better your marriage prospects. And that meant the bigger the unwinding when things fell apart. Everything needed to be calculated. What was returned, what was lost, and, awkwardly, what had mysteriously depreciated. Like the polished bronze mirror you gave him. Or the ebony writing desk from Alexandria. Both are absent from the return pile. In their place, a chipped oil lamp and a half-used jar of imported honey. Which would be sweet, if it weren't so obviously petty. There's also the issue of shared slaves. In elite households, slaves were not only workers but valuable assets. Upon divorce, they too were divided. Sometimes by origin, sometimes by skill set, and, bizarrely, sometimes by lottery. There's a record of one couple who split their household by drawing names from an urn. The wife got the head cook, the husband got the wine steward, and both agreed that the bath attendants could rotate between them monthly. Efficiency over sentiment. In your case, you get to keep Livia, the kitchen slave. She's delighted. Not because she prefers your seasoning, but because your ex has developed a troubling taste for undercooked lentils. Some Roman women negotiated to keep certain slaves based on emotional attachment. Others were forced to watch longtime servants reassigned like livestock. You remember the tearful farewell between your daughter and her nursemaid, who now lives 2 streets away but may as well be across the Rubicon. Some fringe stories tell of women who disguised slaves as relatives to avoid losing them in a divorce. One even faked a birth certificate to claim her maid was actually her long-lost cousin. Improbable? Maybe. But creative? Absolutely. As for real estate, that's trickier. Unless the wife's dowry included land, and unless she had unusual rights to it, it stayed with the husband. This meant women often lost not just their homes, but their entire domestic world. That's why many divorced Roman women returned to their father's house. Not just for protection or social propriety, but because there was nowhere else to go. You, however, managed to hold on to a small property on the Aventine. A gift from your uncle. Technically separate from the dowry. And now? A sanctuary. It's not grand, but it's quiet. And it has a view of the Tiber that, on windy days, makes the city smell like something other than sweat and fish sauce. You close the dowry chest slowly, gently brushing away dust. You'll have someone go over the inventory scroll again, just in case something changes. Like your ex deciding to return the tutors. Or the honey. You allow yourself a laugh. Because of course the honey's gone. Sweet things rarely survive divorce. Still, you feel lighter. You're not the same girl who packed this chest years ago. Back then, every item felt like a promise. Now, they're just things. Nice things. Useful things. But not your identity. You hear the bell from your atrium, someone's arrived. Likely a messenger with your ex's revised version of the property list. Maybe he's offering the goose again. You whisper to the cat, if he does, we're making stew. You're reclining on a worn but comfortable couch in your triclinium, sipping watered-down wine and eavesdropping. Not intentionally, of course, but when your neighbor's voice is practically echoing across the atrium, what are you supposed to do? Pretend the gossip isn't fascinating? Apparently, Claudia from across the alley was just divorced for the third time. And this time? It's messy. Her ex accused her of wearing too much perfume in public, which, in Roman moral math, implies flirtation. And flirtation implies infidelity. And infidelity implies, well, you get it. Rome's like a giant whispering toga party. The thing is, Roman divorce isn't always a private affair. Sure, the paperwork, when there is any, is straightforward. A statement, maybe a witness, a few restitutions. But the aftermath? That's performed for the entire neighborhood. Especially if you're a woman. Because unlike men, who often bounced from one marriage to another with their reputations intact, or even enhanced, divorced Roman women walked a social tightrope. The whispers. The side glances. The awkward temple visits where suddenly no one has room on the bench. You remember your own post-divorce days. The first time you went to market alone. The fish seller, who used to call you Domina, suddenly mumbled a neutral greeting. The wine merchant offered the cheaper amphora without asking. And one of your ex's clients, formerly a reliable flirt, avoided eye contact entirely. It's not that you were disgraced. Just, gently shelved. Historians still argue whether Roman women suffered formal social penalties for divorce or whether most stigma was informal and class-based. certainly, the elite could rebound better. If you were wealthy, well-connected, and carried yourself with a mix of dignity and sarcasm, you might even come out ahead. Take Livia Drusilla, for example. She divorced her husband while pregnant with her second child, and married Octavian, later Augustus, not long after. Scandalous? Yes. Effective? Extremely. She went from whispered about to empress without ever apologizing. Though historians still debate whether the first husband got a goodbye scroll or just a polite nod at the forum. Of course, not everyone gets an imperial glow-up. Lower status women, especially freed women or those married to struggling tradesmen, often faced harsher judgment. No parade of suitors. No villa to retreat to. Just suspicious neighbors, uncertain finances, and maybe a matronly aunt who thinks this never would have happened under the Republic. Public shame could even become formalized. If a woman was caught in adultery, her husband had a legal obligation, under Augustus's Lex Julia de Adulteriis, to divorce her and prosecute. If he didn't, he could be charged for tolerating immorality. That's right, not divorcing her could land him in trouble. Rome wasn't subtle about morals when politics were involved. You shudder, thinking of poor Julia, the emperor's own daughter, exiled for her behavior. She was known for her wit, beauty, and unfortunate tendency to mock the regime, while allegedly having affairs with half the Senate. Her father Augustus, ever the moral reformer, banished her to a rocky island. Talk about family drama. But let's not forget, divorce could also bring private relief. Some Roman women, once freed from marriage, blossomed. Literally. They wore brighter stolas, visited friends more often, even dabbled in business ventures. One widow you knew opened a perfume stall and made a fortune selling saffron-scented oils. Her slogan? For new beginnings, and better endings. There's even a fringe theory that some elite women orchestrated divorces to break free from dull marriages and strategically remarry. Letters from senatorial families hint at quiet manipulations, feigned illnesses, delayed dowry returns, suspiciously timed visits from cousins. Not technically illegal. Just smart. You finish your wine and step outside, wrapping a light shawl around your shoulders. The street smells like rain-damp stone and simmering lentils. A group of boys runs past, one holding a wooden sword too big for his arm. You nod at the baker's wife, who gives you a cautious smile. She was cold to you for months after your separation. But now? Maybe she's curious. Or maybe she's considering her own situation. At the fountain, you overhear two matrons discussing another recent divorce. He gave her back her dowry and the villa in Baiae, one says, eyebrows raised. What did she have on him? You smile without meaning to. Because sometimes, divorces were negotiated like hostage trades. Secrets for property. Silence for reputation. And if you played your cards right, you walked away not just with your linens and furniture, but with leverage. Still, you know the dance isn't over. There are temples you no longer visit. dinner invitations that never arrive. Men who look once, then pretend not to. Rome is nothing if not performative. And you? You're learning to perform right back. You wear your stola a little cleaner, your jewelry more deliberately chosen. You laugh louder at dinner parties, especially when someone makes a joke about second marriages. You've had practice. You know the beats. And if someone calls you divorcee with a sneer, you gently correct them, I'm experienced. There's a story, half history, half rumor, of a Roman woman who, after 3 divorces, commissioned a small statue of Venus holding scrolls. She placed it in her atrium with a plaque, "To Love," and all her footnotes. No one dared insult her after that. You consider doing the same. Because here's the unspoken truth, in Rome, marriage was often a transaction. But divorce? That was performance art. An act of public unpairing. A theater of exit strategies. And the ones who thrived weren't just lucky, they were clever, stubborn, and stylish enough to make leaving look like winning. You take the long way home, past a temple, past a tavern, past the ex who used to make you feel like a child in your own house. He nods. You nod back. Cordial. Distant. Triumphant in your own quiet way. You're not ashamed. Not anymore. You made it through the public shame and the private silence. And now? You've got the better cook. And the better pillows. It's the late afternoon in the Forum, and you find yourself in a familiar Roman scene, political chatter, sandal scuffs against marble, and someone shouting about grain prices like it's a gladiator match. But this time, you're not here to shop or argue with a linen vendor. You're here for the spectacle, the kind of public drama Rome excels at. Because nothing gets tongues wagging quite like a high-profile divorce. In this city of ambition and legacy, when Rome's elite fall out of love, or convenience, it's never just personal. It's political theater, with every broken vow echoing through Senate halls and into street gossip. You know the stories. Everyone does. They circulate faster than plague rats in a bathhouse. Take the case of Julius Caesar. He divorced his second wife, Pompeia, with the now famous line, "Caesar's wife must be above suspicion." The scandal? A raucous all-female religious festival, an ambitious young nobleman sneaking in disguised as a woman, and rumors Pompeia was too flirty with the wrong guests. Was there actual proof? Nope. But the whisper was enough to ruin her standing, and Caesar's image. So, goodbye Pompeia. Cold, but effective. Historians still debate whether Caesar truly suspected his wife or just needed to clean house for political reasons. Either way, the divorce cemented his reputation as a man of moral stringency, even as he seduced queens and annoyed half the Senate. Then there's Cicero, Rome's golden-tongued orator and noted oversharer. His letters reveal every petty emotion of his divorce from Terentia, his wife of 3 decades. The man who could convince a jury with 2 well-placed adjectives couldn't figure out how to apologize for neglect. He blamed her for financial troubles, moral lapses, and a general lack of adoration. But scholars today wonder, was Terentia the problem, or was Cicero just insufferable? Considering he remarried quickly to a teenage heiress mainly for her dowry, the jury's leaning toward the latter. And let's not forget Cato the Younger, known for his stubbornness and perpetual scowl. In a wild twist of Roman social engineering, he actually gave his wife Marcia back to her first husband, Hortensius, so that Hortensius could have legitimate heirs. When Hortensius died, Cato took her back again. Practical? Maybe. Romantic? Not in the slightest. Marcia herself is silent in the records, but you have to wonder if she packed and unpacked the same dowry chest 3 times. These were the power players, men whose love lives played out like Senate sessions, full of strategic alliances and sudden betrayals. But what about the women? What did a high-profile Roman divorce feel like from their side? Imagine being Scribonia, wife of Octavian, later Augustus, and being divorced the very day you gave birth to his daughter Julia. Not a week later. Not after the postpartum wine. That day. The reason? He claimed she was too emotional. As if that's not the least surprising thing about a woman who's just delivered a future rebel in swaddling. Still, high-status women had their own weapons. Julia, that same daughter, grew up to become a symbol of elegance, wit, and wild rebellion. Married off in a series of political matches, she eventually buckled under her father's rigid moral codes. Her affairs became public, her laughter too loud, her intelligence too threatening. Eventually, Augustus exiled her. Some whisper it wasn't about infidelity at all. It was about power. Julia was too popular. Too capable. And Rome didn't like a woman who made divorce look like freedom. And speaking of drama, there's the fringe theory that Mark Antony divorced Octavia, Octavian's sister, via messenger. While that might be exaggerated, we do know he abandoned her and his children in Rome while he lived in Alexandria with Cleopatra. That act turned Octavia into a tragic heroine and Cleopatra into Rome's favored villain. Octavian milked it for propaganda like a street bard with a lyre and a dramatic streak. Rome loved a spectacle. So much so that some divorces became plays, not literally on stage, but in the way people reenacted and whispered about them. Did you hear what Agrippina said before leaving Claudius? Someone might say, knowing full well there's no record. But that doesn't stop the imagination. Divorce in high society was rarely about just 2 people. It was about networks, alliances, inheritances, reputations. And when it all crumbled, the city watched. And judged. And took sides. But oddly, divorce didn't always end a person's power. Sometimes it magnified it. Roman citizens respected resilience. If you could survive a public unraveling and still show up at the baths looking unbothered, that was strength. You pass a scroll seller hawking the latest political satire. A cheap cartoon shows a senator crying in his toga while his wife tosses his laurel wreath in a chamber pot. You smirk. Fiction, maybe. But plausible? Absolutely. The scroll also has a biting line about Rome's second wives making better husbands. You don't even try to decode it. Roman humor, like its politics, is layered in irony and cheap wine. A few years ago, someone at a dinner party whispered that a former praetor's wife was accepting divorce proposals in advance, like dinner RSVPs. Ridiculous? Probably. But in a city where matchmaking and ambition waltz together, it's also not entirely impossible. Because in Rome, marriage was just one move on the board. Divorce? That was another. And sometimes, the smartest players were the ones who knew when to tip the board over entirely. So here you are, sipping tepid wine in the forum shadows, watching another senator argue with a client while his wife climbs into a litter, expression unreadable, jewelry flawless. No one says it, but everyone knows, they're separating. Not today. But soon. And someone will turn it into a cautionary tale, a party joke, or a political parable. Because in Rome, divorce isn't a scandal. It's a story. And everyone wants to be the one telling it. It's late, the moon is high, and you're standing in front of a tiny shrine near your doorway, the kind that smells faintly of olive oil, wax, and old terracotta. You whisper a few words to the household gods, Laras et Penates, just in case they're listening. Because in Rome, even your divorce might come down to what the gods think of your kitchen shelf arrangement and how often you light incense. See, for all its lawyers and Latin logic, Rome runs on omens, dreams, and that deep-rooted fear that someone in the clouds is keeping score. You remember the morning you first thought about ending it. Not because of a fight. Not even because of the subtle way your spouse began referring to you as that woman in the atrium. No, it was the dream. You were standing barefoot in a dry riverbed, surrounded by weeping figs. A snake appeared, offered you a ring, then burst into flame. Classic pre-divorce dream, honestly. The next day, the augur you bribed said it was a bad omen for marriage. But a good one for personal clarity. You weren't sure if that was priestly wisdom or a coded pitch for his nephew's law firm. Either way, it stuck. Because for many Romans, divorce wasn't just emotional or strategic, it was cosmic. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed the gods weighed in on marriages, or whether it was just a useful cover for doing what you already wanted to do. But the signs? Oh, they were everywhere. A black dog howling 3 times near your doorstep. A clay figurine toppling off the shelf. Your parrot repeating your ex's name while facing west. The world was full of signals, and Romans were full-time interpreters. Some blamed Mercury, god of communication, for misunderstandings that spiraled into separations. Others cursed Venus, accusing her of favoring one partner while abandoning the other. More poetic souls claimed their marriage was under the wrong star. And if you happen to be into astrology, which, let's face it, most upper-class Romans were, you might literally chart your love life's demise. There was one senator's wife, noble, sharp-tongued, known for her devotion to horoscopes. She claimed her marriage was doomed from the moment their charts revealed opposing Mars placements. She divorced her husband mid-lunch, handed him the roast dormouse, and said, "You were a Saturn mistake." He never recovered. And then there are the superstitions. When you moved out, you made sure not to pack your shoes before your amulets. Because everyone knows that invites a curse. You refused to sweep on the day of departure, lest you sweep your luck away. And you left a coin in the household altar for the next tenant. Not generosity. Insurance. But not all the rituals were sour. Some women whispered secret blessings when reclaiming their dowry, pressing laurel leaves into the fabric, murmuring to Juno for peace. A few even hosted small gatherings with wine, fruit, and discreet toasts, to freedom and better judgment. There's even a fringe belief, barely mentioned in textbooks, that certain temples quietly offered unwedding rites. Nothing official, mind you. Just an evening offering, a candle, and a murmured thank you to whichever deity you believed got you out alive. Some left tokens, a broken ring, a ribbon, or even a scrap of marriage contract ash. Of course, there were risks to involving religion too directly. If a marriage had been solemnized in a sacred rite, conferratio, the full religious ceremony, you couldn't just walk away with a sandal toss and a scribbled note. You needed a matching ritual to dissolve it. One that sometimes required both parties, specific words, and, in one case, a chicken. That particular divorce made headlines, or would have, if Rome had newspapers. A priestly couple tried to split, but the officiant dropped the ceremonial knife, the chicken squawked at the wrong moment, and someone spilled the wine. The result? Bad omen. Divorce delayed. Tension extended another month. You remember this story every time you see a chicken now. Still, belief could bring comfort. After your divorce, you started lighting a small oil lamp beside your bed, not for light, but for Hestia's Roman counterpart, Vesta. She's the goddess of hearth and home, and it just felt right. Like you were asking her to watch over your new, quieter household. No grand gestures. Just quiet peace. You also stopped visiting the Temple of Concordia. She's the goddess of harmony, and frankly, things felt a bit awkward. You weren't sure if she'd approve. So instead, you left flowers at Diana's shrine, independent, wild Diana. The original, don't need a man, icon. You weren't alone. Romans often shifted their religious allegiances after divorce. Husbands sought new patron deities, especially if their ex had stronger temple connections. Women sometimes turned to imported cults, like Isis or Cybele, goddesses known for their protective, untamed, and sometimes scandalous reputations. But let's be real, not everyone took it seriously. Your cousin once divorced after his wife claimed the cat staring at her during dinner was a ghost of his past lovers. He rolled his eyes, moved out, and told friends, "I'm not losing my villa to a tabby." Later, he blamed Neptune. Something about watery emotions. Yet, even skeptics hedged their bets. You might laugh off the omens, but you'd still knock on wood, or marble, or say a quick prayer before a new relationship. Because deep down, Rome wasn't just run by politics and coin. It was run by fear. Fear of divine retaliation, missed signs, and poorly chosen sacrifices. There's an old Roman saying, "The gods watch the hearth." Which might explain why you cleaned yours extra carefully after the separation. Not out of habit. Out of respect. Just in case they were watching. Now, as you step inside from the shrine, the air feels cooler. Softer. You light the final candle on the windowsill, not for any specific deity. Just to say, this chapter's closed. And tomorrow? You'll ask the augur about that new dream. The one with the white owl and the silver sandals. No rush. The gods aren't going anywhere. You leave the noise of Rome behind. The clamor of senators, the dusty clang of bronze coins, even the endless gossip about who left whom and why, it all fades as the cart rolls slowly down the uneven road. This time, you're heading away from the heart of the Republic. No colonnades. No marble steps. Just countryside. And eventually, a town where few wear togas and even fewer care what Cicero thinks. Because divorce outside the city walls? It's a different animal. In the provinces, those towns scattered across the Italian countryside and the far-flung corners of the empire, marriage and divorce often play by their own rulebooks. Technically, yes, Roman law stretches its shadow across the land. But in practice? Local custom, family pressure, and the priest down the road have just as much say. You arrive in a small Gallic settlement, stone houses, a modest temple, and a very bossy goose standing guard over a fountain. Here, most people aren't Roman citizens. They're locals, tribal descendants, traders, former slaves, or second-generation immigrants trying to go Roman, just enough to be left alone. And this means that while Roman-style marriage, matrimonium, exists, plenty of people still follow older traditions, Celtic handfastings, Egyptian sibling unions, yes, really, or African dowry systems that view marriage as more economic alliance than romantic dream. So what happens when those marriages fall apart? Well, in many cases, nothing legal. Divorce out here can be quiet. Sometimes it's just someone leaving in the night with their belongings and a stubborn look. No scrolls, no notaries, just an awkward silence at the next market day. Other times, a family elder steps in to mediate, maybe a matriarch, or a respected uncle who settles the issue over flatbread and stern sighs. Historians still debate whether these divorces had any official bite. Could they be recognized back in Rome? Did the emperor care if a couple in Numidia split after 5 years and 3 goats? Some say yes, if citizenship was involved. Others argue that as long as no one wrote in with complaints, the empire turned a blind eye. One thing's certain, these outsider divorces could be far more flexible, or far more brutal. Take, for instance, the case of a Syrian woman married to a Roman auxiliary soldier. She traveled with his unit, raised their children on the fringes of a military camp, and one day, poof, he transferred to another outpost without her. No letter. No coin. Just vanished. Was it abandonment? Divorce? Both? Turns out, there was no consistent answer. Some garrison commanders helped wives like her, pressuring husbands to send support or even forcibly reuniting families. Others shrugged. Soldiers moved. Women coped. That was the empire. You stroll through the provincial market now, passing stalls filled with dried figs, dyed cloth, and odd trinkets that claim to ward off heartbreak. A local woman, sharp eyes, silver bangles, waves you over. She tells you about her ex-husband, a Roman traitor who promised citizenship after marriage but fled after 2 winters. She never saw a single coin from his estate. He was cursed, she adds with a smirk. I used the lemon spell. You don't ask for details. The more time you spend in these outer regions, the more you realize just how patchworked Roman marriage really was. Local identities shaped everything. In Egypt, marriage contracts could be written in Greek or Demotic, and sometimes involved legal clauses that would make a Roman senator blush. One even included a line about the husband owing silver if he dared insult his wife's mother. Genius. In Gaul, tribal tradition sometimes required symbolic gestures for divorce, breaking a twig in public, returning the bride price, or tossing certain items, like a hair comb, into a river. Was it legal under Roman law? Not really. But socially? Completely binding. You pause by a small temple devoted to a hybrid goddess, half Roman, half local deity. People leave offerings, cheese, coins, a tiny clay sandal. There's something comforting in the way Rome bends here. It doesn't erase. It absorbs. But you also feel the tension. If you're a woman in the provinces, especially without Roman citizenship, your options after divorce can be razor-thin. You might return to your father's house, if he'll have you. You might remarry, quickly, before the neighbors get ideas. Or you might scrape by selling herbs, fabric, or, in the worst cases, yourself. One fringe tale tells of a woman in Britannia who, after a particularly ugly separation, carved runes into her ex-husband's drinking cup. Supposedly, he lost all his livestock that year. Scholars debate the magical potency. You're just impressed she had the nerve to steal the cup. Yet not everything is hardship. In some provincial areas, women had more legal and social room to breathe. Roman citizenship wasn't required to wield power, it just helped. A Carthaginian woman might own property. A Dacian widow might run a shipping operation. Divorce didn't end them. Sometimes, it launched them. And for many, divorce was simply practical. If the harvest failed, if the family alliance soured, if someone converted to a different god and refused to sacrifice at the family hearth, these weren't irreconcilable differences, they were economic survival points. You changed partners like you changed crops. Of course, it wasn't all rational detachment. You hear stories, some embroidered, some not, about revenge acts, sandals nailed to doors, honey poured into locks, cursed dolls buried under thresholds. Emotional fallout, even out here, still finds expression. Just less paperwork. You watch as two women pass by, one carrying a child, the other hauling a basket of cabbages. They laugh, their voices rising above the clatter of donkey hooves. It's clear, one of them recently left her husband. The other helped her move. There's no scandal, no whispering. Just life. Moving on. Back in Rome, your separation would have meant lawyer meetings, reputation concerns, maybe even Senate rumors if you were important enough. Here, it's more personal. Less performative. Divorce isn't a public event. It's a decision, a step, a reshuffling of space. As dusk falls, you realize, outside the city walls, Rome's grip loosens just enough to let life flow a little differently. Love still burns. People still part. But they do it in languages Rome doesn't fully understand. You breathe in the cooler air, touched by unfamiliar spice and hearth smoke. And for a moment, you're grateful you came out here. Rome is the center of the world, yes. But the edges? The edges are where things get interesting. The road back to Rome feels longer, somehow. As your sandals press into the ancient stone of the Via, the land shifts gradually from open hills to more crowded villas, then packed tenements, and finally the thrum of Rome's ever-breathing heart. But something's different now. Maybe it's you. Or maybe it's the way marriage, and divorce, keep evolving right under your dusty feet. Because in Rome, change isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just the slow creep of policy, power, and people whispering behind columns until whispers become laws. Back in the early days of the Republic, marriage was about family alliances. Divorce was rare, frowned upon, even. You didn't leave a spouse because you were unhappy. You stuck it out, honored the contract, and tried not to disgrace your ancestors. But fast forward to the late Republic and early Empire, and that old rigidity starts to wobble. What happened? Well, for starters, Rome exploded. Territory. Wealth. Diversity. Suddenly, people weren't just marrying to solidify old patrician bloodlines. They were marrying for power plays, property grabs, or even, gasp, mutual fondness. And when expectations shifted, so did the willingness to leave. Historians still argue whether Augustus's moral reforms actually worked or just made people sneakier. In the early 1st century BCE, Augustus launched a campaign to reinvigorate Roman values. Laws encouraging marriage, penalizing bachelors, and offering tax perks for families with children. It was kind of like a Roman dating app, but instead of swiping right, you risked exile. And yes, Augustus was very into regulating marriage and divorce. He wanted the elite to breed well and often, to strengthen the moral backbone of Rome. So he passed laws like the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus and Lex Papia Papia, mouthfuls that basically tried to make respectable, baby-producing marriages the default. But enforcing morality through legislation, Let's just say it had mixed results. You remember a friend who rushed into marriage with a senator's daughter to avoid tax penalties. They split a year later when she accidentally burned his prized mosaic. They divorced politely, but he blamed Augustus. If not for those damn Lex Julia statutes, I'd still have my dignity. And my floor. The tension between public virtue and private messiness defined the imperial era. Divorce was legal and technically simple. Say it, separate, settle the dowry. But suddenly, your choices could get political. Especially if you were powerful. Take Livia Drusilla. She divorced her first husband to marry Octavian, later Augustus. Rumors swirled that Octavian strongly encouraged the separation, possibly while Livia was still pregnant. Historians aren't unanimous on the timeline, which means you can still debate it over wine. Either way, it set a precedent. Under the empire, divorce became not just a personal act but a strategic one. Emperors divorced for optics. Wives left husbands to align with better families. And anyone with a scroll and ambition saw the writing on the wall: marriage was a costume. Divorce was a scene change. But here's the twist: divorce wasn't always a step down. For some Roman women, it was empowerment in action. In fact, by the 2nd century CE, elite women divorced as often as men. Some even did it multiple times. Serial monogamy, modern scholars call it. Romans might have called it taking the scenic route to satisfaction. There's a famous anecdote about a woman who divorced her husband because he had terrible table manners. Not infidelity. Not abuse. Just loud slurping and olive pits on the floor. Whether it's true or just poetic gossip, it shows the cultural shift. No longer did one need a catastrophic reason to walk away. And yet, access mattered. If you were rich, literate, and well-connected, divorce was an option. If you were poor, enslaved, or foreign, not so much. For many lower-class couples, separation happened informally. You moved out. You told your neighbors. You survived. Slaves, of course, couldn't marry in the legal sense, which meant they couldn't divorce either. But they formed long-term pairings called contubernium, unofficial unions often broken at the whim of an owner or the sale of one partner. No paperwork. Just heartbreak. By the time you reach the 3rd century CE, everything's loosened a bit. More provincial influence. More social mixing. And though the old Roman elites still grumble about degeneracy, most people just get on with life. You marry. You try. You fail. You move on. Sound familiar? But with all this change comes pushback. Conservative writers like Seneca and Juvenal start railing against what they see as moral collapse. Juvenal famously mocked women who changed husbands like tunics, claiming some married 8 times in 5 years. Whether he was exaggerating or projecting his own issues, probably both, the sentiment stuck. You've definitely heard an elder neighbor mutter, back in Cato's day, as if stoic fidelity and well-tied sandals solved everything. Still, the shift was undeniable. Religious influence added a new flavor in later centuries. As Christianity grew, so did its ideas about marriage as sacred and permanent. While early Christian communities tolerated divorce, and even allowed remarriage in some cases, later church leaders grew stricter. By the 4th century CE, imperial edicts began echoing Christian values, discouraging divorce and nudging the empire toward monogamous, till death do us part, ideals. One fringe theory suggests this moral tightening was a reaction to perceived instability. After all, Rome was beginning to fray, military pressure, economic wobble, a dozen emperors in a decade. Maybe the idea was, if we can't control the borders, let's at least control the bedrooms. You stop now, leaning against a stone wall where vines creep up through old mortar. A couple walks past, young, laughing, wearing mismatched sandals and probably in the middle of a loud domestic negotiation. You wonder what their story is. Will they last? Will they split over bread preference or political allegiances? Does it matter? The Rome of today, your today, isn't the same Rome that passed the Lex Julia, or lit altars to Juno Regina for marital harmony. It's not even the Rome that whispered about Caesar's divorces or Livia's ambition. It's a Rome in motion. And you? You're part of that change. Whether you're divorced once, twice, or never, you live in a world where marriage is a tool, a tether, or a chance. And divorce, though sometimes bitter, is often the beginning of something else. Maybe freedom. Maybe peace. Maybe a new apartment without the smell of your ex's fish sauce addiction. As the sun dips behind the skyline of tiled roofs and temple spires, you exhale. Rome has changed. You've changed with it. And love? Love always finds a way to reinvent itself, even under the weight of marble. The sun sets lazily behind Rome, casting long amber fingers through the narrow alleyways, warming the cobblestones for just a moment before slipping away. You move slower now. It's not exhaustion, it's that kind of quiet at the end of something long and strangely lovely. You've wandered through centuries of messy unions and even messier endings. Now it's time to sit, rest, and spend one final evening with someone who's been through it all. She's not famous. No statues were carved in her honor. No poet penned sonnets to her sorrow. But she lived, married, divorced, and, perhaps most remarkably of all, survived with her sense of self intact. You find her in a modest home tucked between a bathhouse and a bakery. The walls are painted with faded garden scenes, lavender trees, doves, a painted breeze. She's seated by an open window, silver strands of hair tucked behind one ear, staring out over the rooftops with that peaceful, unreadable look that only comes after a life of deep experience and deeper silence. She was married at 16, divorced at 22. Her husband, wealthy, loud, and wholly uninterested in her opinions, preferred his political ambitions and the company of his secretary. She endured 6 years of polite dinners and colder beds before finally sending him a message with his sandals neatly bundled and set outside the door. "Take them," she wrote, "and leave the rest." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even public. She did what many women of her class could, initiated the split, reclaimed her dowry, and moved forward with a quiet dignity that cut deeper than any insult. Now, decades later, she doesn't speak bitterly. In fact, she rarely mentions him at all. What she remembers is the house she bought afterward. The olive grove she cultivated with her own coin. The 2 apprentices she mentored, both girls, both bright, both warned never to marry for a surname. Historians still debate whether divorced Roman women like her found freedom or simply settled for less. But sitting with her now, hearing her laugh softly about the time she pretended to be deaf for a week just to avoid another suitor, well, you get the feeling she's more than settled. She's flourished. There's a peace in her presence. Like old wood that's been through storms and still smells of cedar. She doesn't dress in mourning or drape herself in regret. She wears a simple stola, hand-stained with ink from the letters she still writes to nieces and nephews scattered across the empire. You sip warm wine with her as the night deepens. Outside, someone plays a soft reed flute. Inside, she tells you about her second life, the one after marriage, after separation. It was filled with books, long walks, and market mornings where she picked fruit without anyone hovering or hurrying her along. Freedom wasn't a single act. It was cumulative. It grew. And then she says something you won't forget. Divorce wasn't the end, she murmurs, eyes reflecting candlelight. It was just when the noise stopped. That's when I could finally hear myself think. You nod, unsure whether to feel sad or deeply, deeply soothed. There's no crescendo here, no grand lesson painted across temple walls. Just one woman, in one house, living quietly after all the dust of her early years has settled. It's not a statue. But it is a legacy. And now, slowly, the world outside begins to hush. The sky has gone dark, velvet dark, and the last heat of the day exhales from the walls in gentle, sleepy breaths. You pull your cloak tighter, your body softening into the night, your thoughts stretched and relaxed like a cat in a sunbeam. This story, so full of partings and paper-thin power games, has unwound itself into something quieter than you expected. Divorce in ancient Rome wasn't always cruel or catastrophic. Sometimes it was methodical. Sometimes it was liberating. Sometimes it was just another Tuesday. You've met senators and servants, angry poets, and women who preferred their own gardens to another round of disappointment. You've walked the stone paths of provinces and paced the marbled atriums of Rome itself. And in all that wandering, you've seen that even 2,000 years ago, people just wanted the same things: dignity, autonomy, and maybe someone who didn't leave olive pits on the floor. So now, let the voices fade. Let the flicker of the oil lamp slow, the air grow cooler, your limbs heavier. You are not a Roman wife, or maybe you were, in some past life, but tonight, you are still. You are safe. You are surrounded by old stories, and none of them can touch you now. Tomorrow the world will turn again. Lovers will quarrel. Sandals will be packed. Contracts will be broken. But tonight, you are floating in history's gentle lull. You are home. You are whole. You are free.